If I was in Florida, land trusts have the same protections as LLCs. So and we don't have doc stamp fees if you have a mortgage on a property and we transfer it. So I might use land trust there. Or if I'm in Texas, I might say, hey, let's use a series LLC, because instead of one LLC and then it can have cells, that we use those. Like, it always changes depending on where you're at, but the principle is the same. We want to isolate the liability of that asset from the other assets. We call them risk assets. And then also you are a risk asset, so we want to isolate it from you.
Hi everybody, Jose Luis Morales here. Welcome back. Today we have the one and only Toby Mathis, tax attorney from Las Vegas, Nevada. And today he is going to be sharing with us ways to protect your assets for real estate investors, meaning protect them from liability. So a lot of people own real estate property, but if not managed or put into the right entities or followed a certain process, it could actually lead to personal, business, and real estate liability for you. So today we have Toby to be able to guide us on that. Welcome to the show, Toby. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm doing absolutely fantastic today, and I hope everybody else who's listening to this or watching this is having a great day too.
Same here. So for our viewers that don't know who you are, which is hard to miss because you're all over YouTube and social media, they don't know who you are. Who is Toby Mathis, and how did you get involved in this wonderful world of real estate and specifically become a tax attorney?
Really good question, and hopefully I won't disappoint you with the answer. Yeah, I do love social media. I do love sharing and educating. And I'm very passionate about this area because for the last 25 years, it's where I've spent my time. I could go all the way back into the 80s, probably, I think it was 1988, 89. I met a gentleman who was a realtor in Burien, Washington, of all places. I went to high school there, went to college in Seattle, and went to law school in Seattle. But I met a gentleman, and he had this big old list of properties, just like hundreds of properties in Seattle and in Denver. And I still remember that list. It was like 180 properties, which just seemed like the biggest chunk of wealth ever. And he was a pretty basic, unassuming dude. He wore a white button-down shirt and gray pants, and he was a friend of a mentor to mine. And he said, "Hey, you really ought to meet Boyd. He's a really good guy. This is what he does. He's really, really rich." And I was like, "Okay, that's great. Like, money doesn't mean much to you when you're a young person. You're like, hey, I want to be a lawyer, or hey, I want to do this. You're not too focused on the idea of legacy and wealth." And it was so interesting sitting there going, oh, this guy's got to be worth a ton. It never clicked until about 10 years later that he had a cash printing machine with all those properties. He owned all these properties. They were all cash flow properties. He told me, hey, I like buying in these particular areas. I think it was Aurora, Colorado, that area. And then the Seattle area, he loved White Center and Burien and some of the outlying areas. And he had these properties, and he was like, oh, the rents are really good. Rents didn't even compute to me. I just remember going, oh, that's neat. How much is the house worth? Right. It wasn't until years later that it clicked. So finally, that's just kind of left its mark. I became an attorney because my mentor said, you should become an attorney because all my attorneys aren't very smart. They're not very good business people. He said to his son, hey, you need to go to law school, and Toby, you need to go to law school. And together we can, that way we don't have to listen to these people, because attorneys are notorious deal killers. And I won't bore you with all the details, but they almost destroyed a $10 million deal. What? That he was doing. And thank God we didn't listen to them, and we were able to get it done. So I went to law school, his son went to law school, and I came out and I joined with a partner and started Anderson Business Advisors. I think that was in 1999, focusing like a laser beam on tax and asset protection, specifically for investors and business owners, because that's who I dealt with. My partner grew up doing, Clint Coons, he grew up doing apartment buildings. And we just basically had our backgrounds, and we said, hey, it's underserved. There's a lot of people out there that are advising other folks who do not do what they're advising. So this is kind of weird. Like, it's the bald barber, somebody telling you what you should be doing with your hair when they don't have any, right? And so you have these lawyers and these accountants stuff that never invest in real estate, don't run a business, don't have employees, don't have all those things. And that was what we saw. And, 25 years later, since I started, we have over 500 employees. We We have a robust business, and that's part of what we do. The other part of what we do is we are avid investors. My partner and I are well over 300 properties. We have everything from mobile home parks, apartment buildings, a bunch of single family. We've had warehouses. We have commercial buildings. We have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, quite a few single family. That's my bread and butter. That's what I love, because you can directly impact a tenant's life. So like in a positive way when you have your own properties. And I get to do this as a volunteer. I just get to have fun every day. I get to talk to people like you. I would love to hear your story. I'll say it. It's always fun to see how people build their wealth, what makes them tick, kind of what their philosophy is. And I'm just staunchly on the side of anybody out there who's going to try to create a legacy. Here's a mind blower. What's your legacy going to be in 200 years? Give yourself permission to actually ask that question and come up with a valid answer. Actually, what are you creating? Right. And I love inviting people to have that thought and actually start putting it onto paper, and then creating something that's going to be life-changing for their family or for the organizations they care about for years and years, decades to come. It's actually just a hoot.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And by far, this is my favorite part of my job as well, too. Like connecting with people like you, kind of seeing how they built their wealth, and also like education, like educating our viewers as to how to do certain things. So I'm super obviously excited about this topic. So let's get into the topic about asset protection. If I own real properties, if I have a business, should the business be under my name?
No! God, please, no! No!
Or my wife's name? Or how do I protect the assets from liability that comes along with owning a business or owning properties as well, too?
Yeah, great questions, and something that everybody asks when they're getting started. And there's a variety of answers that they get, right? So a lot, like if you ask the accountant, they're going to say, well, it's easier just to be a sole proprietor. If you ask the attorney, they're almost always going to say, well, in LLC, we want to isolate the liability. If you talk to a business planner, they say, well, it depends on where you're getting your funding. And the real answer is it's a combination of those, but I can say that there's universal principles. I always look at what's the worst thing that can happen. So let's say that I am a doctor and I buy a house to be a rental. You listen to somebody who knows real estate, and they say, hey, cash flow real estate's where it's at. You get a bunch of tax benefits, and you get this cash flow, and it goes on forever. You could have cash flow for 300 years. Your family, your kids could be enjoying the benefit of your purchase today. And they go out and they buy a cash flow property. Say they go to Kansas City, Missouri. They go to Ohio, they go to North Carolina, they go to Indiana, they buy a house at $100,000. What my job is to say, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? If you just buy that in your individual name, you have unfettered liability. So let's say that the house burns down and hurts somebody, or you have toxic mold not covered by insurance, and all of a sudden you have this big, huge liability and somebody chasing you down. They can take everything else you own. They can even take your house. Like I think you're in California. You have a very low homestead. They could take your personal residence, take the equity right out of that. And people don't realize that there's exposure. So all we do as an asset protection professional is isolate that liability. Let's make sure the worst case scenario is you lose that property, or you lose the equity in that property. You have insurance, make sure you have an umbrella, and then let's isolate that thing down so that there's no reason for anybody to ever try to go out beyond. And so that's kind of step number one. Step number two is you look at the taxes. So if I'm doing real estate, for example, the last thing you're going to do is own cash flow real estate in a C Corp or an S Corp or an LLC, taxed as an S Corp or a C Corp, right? There's certain things that, as from a tax standpoint, make zero sense. You're going to either be a partnership, which we may want. This is what's weird is I may want to have a partnership so that I can have the numbers flow onto page 2 of my Schedule E so I can qualify for more financing, because federal backed loans look at page 2 and use 100% of the income under underwriting, and they use 75% of page 1 of Schedule E for underwriting. Like there's just little things like that. Or I could make it disregarded. Like, hey, I'm buying cash. I'm not worried about financing, and I don't want the hassle of another tax return. Can I set this up to where I never have to worry about that? You look at that next? And then you look at the third prong, which is the business, and you say, will this impact my ability to get loans? So for example, if I open up a business or I set up an entity and I put assets in it, is this going to stop me from growing? There's this old idea that paying zero taxes is a good thing, right? A lot of people will be like, "Oh, my accountant got me to zero. My accountant's so good." And I'm looking at him going, "Yeah, how are you going to build your wealth? How are you going to lever it? You ever gone in to get a loan and you said, by the way, my income was zero, and you hold up your 1040 and you're like, look, it's zero. Isn't that good?" Your lender's going to look at you like you're on Mars, and they're going to say, like, well, you have no income. You're not going to qualify for any loans. And then you say, no, that's just taxes. My tax guy got me to zero. And they're going to say, well, so you're a tax crook. That's even better, right? It's just, you have to weigh these things out and be measured about everything you do and kind of look at it. And unfortunately, unless you're dealing with somebody who actually knows these things and knows these waters, you're probably getting the advice they learned in a class or out of a book or something they've told wrong to clients for the last 30 years. That's just the facts. Like, I'm not trying to be mean, but if somebody does not know the little nuances, they're completely oblivious. Well, they're not burdened by that knowledge, and they'll go ahead and and give out advice. Jose, there was a case, I think it was in about year 2000, where we had a client that was buying a commercial building in California. Mm-hmm. And we recommended that they place it in an entity. At the time, we were using LLCs in California. And we said, hey, make sure that is isolated in an LLC. And the accountant said, I'd advise you against doing that LLC. That's an additional tax return. There's no real exposure to liability in owning real estate. And they actually wrote a letter saying that they would advise against it.
Wow.
And the accountant said, the client came to us and said, well, my accountant says it's not really necessary. At the time, LLCs were brand new. They've been around since 1977, but not all states recognized them. And I think it was about 2003 that everybody said, yeah, LLCs are here to stay. And so you still had professionals that didn't know what these things were. Now you cannot close in a commercial building in your name. Like, good luck buying a building with financing and let it in the bank allowing you to do that as an individual. It's not going to happen. They're going to be like, nope, we want that liability isolated, not just because they want to make sure that their asset doesn't fall into your personal realm, but because they don't want your personal realm to fall into their asset. And what I mean by that is, let's say that it's the same situation as earlier where we have a doctor and they buy a property. Let's just change that up. Let's just say it's you or me and we have kids, and one of our kids gets into a bad car accident. And I followed the accountant's advice and I did not put my building in an LLC, because they said it wasn't necessary from a tax standpoint or would cause that added complexity. That's their favorite. Oh, there's added complexity. That liability means that they could go take that building from me and they could go foreclose on that building. The bank doesn't want that. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. The only person that wants that is the attorney who's representing that party who got into the car accident, saying, I'm going to turn up the pain on you and make you pay me more. So, again, you look at these things over the years, having been experiencing it very differently than what you hear from a lot of people that are learning it out of a book. And I would just give anybody advice. Here's a free piece of advice. When you talk to people, make sure that they're doing what they're teaching you. If you have a professional, make sure that they do what you're doing. You talk to an attorney, make sure that they've done what you are doing so they know the nuances. You talk to an accountant, make sure that they do what you do. Like, it's really hard to find really good accountants out there, and almost always they've run a business or they have investments themselves, and they're doing the exact same thing that they're doing on their return, and they're helping you and they know all the tricks and the little nooks and crannies, and they know what these things are, and they're able to help you as a result.
It's funny that you bring that up, because the same thing happened to me in real estate. Like, when I got started in business, I had a lot of success with investors, working with investors, like specifically for buying and holding. And the reason is that I grew up around investments and I started investing from a very early age. So I would speak their language and I actually understood what they wanted. And on the contrary, I saw like agents that owned zero properties, owned no real estate. They were giving financial advice to investors. and for some reason they weren't ever able to really have the connection that we did because of that. So I agree with that statement 100%. I did want to dig in a little bit deeper. For our viewers, maybe some of them didn't understand what the homestead is. For maybe somebody that doesn't understand what the homestead is, how is it different in different states? And how does that affect, like, if you do get involved in a lawsuit, how does that affect if you're not under an LLC or some sort of asset protection?
Yeah, actually, really good one. So a homestead just means the amount of equity that a creditor cannot take from you in your personal residence. So let's say that I own a home that's worth $2 million and I'm in California, and I have liability to somebody, versus I have that same home worth $2 million, but it's in Florida, and I have liability against somebody. In fact, I'll use an example. Let's use O.J. Simpson. Are you familiar with O.J. Simpson's case where he was acquitted from the criminal prosecution of him allegedly slaying his wife and her lover or her friend, that Ron Goldman. So there was Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, who both lost their lives. And O.J. Simpson was acquitted, but civilly he was found responsible. So the Goldman family sued, and he ended up with I think it was $33 million original judgment. O.J. then went to Florida, and he bought a house in Florida that had a homestead exclusion of 100%. Florida and Texas are the two states that have unlimited homesteads. And all that meant was that even though Ron Goldman or the family had this massive judgment, they could not levy against the home. If he had stayed in California and he owned the same house in California, they could have sold the home, taken the proceeds, and given OJ just the small portion that California allows. I think it's like $75,000. It's a small amount.
Yeah.
And that plays itself out in all jurisdictions. There's a whole wide variety of what your homestead is. And so when you're a guy like me, I'm looking at it going, all right, how much equity do you have in your house? Am I worried? Am I worried in your state? Are there things we can do? Maybe you should take a loan against the house, even a HELOC, just to make it look like there's no equity, because that will still keep a lawyer from saying, that's a great asset for me to target. I'm going to go after that individual's home. And I have seen people lose their houses. I actually had a case early on in my career. It wasn't a case that I handled. It was a gal that came to me after her case was over because she wanted to actually put a plan in place. And she owned, I think it was 15 pieces of property along the East Coast. She had a commercial building in Florida. And you want to watch just gut wrenching. She's talking about how she had this commercial building. It was 3 stories, and she had a manager managing it, and they hired window washers, which very common if you have a commercial property. They're going to hire out just about everything. So they had these people wash the windows, and one of them electrocuted themselves. They used aluminum ladders on a commercial building and hit a line. So he electrocuted himself. The guy that was working with him tries to save him and tries to go climb the ladder and immediately electrocutes himself. So he had 2 wrongful deaths. And so again, all the smart people out there going, but you have insurance and this, that. Look at your exclusions. One of the things was the manager hired someone that had a license and bonding numbers, but one of those numbers was not in effect at the time. So they had an exclusion, and they were able to deny liability. So the lawyers are like, oh, don't worry. There's plenty of equity in the property. Have you ever gone to a foreclosure auction? They do not pay full price for property. So they sold the commercial piece of property, and it was insufficient. You paid the lawyers, the sheriff, you paid the original lien on the house, and on the property, and there was very little left over. So they went to the next property. All of her properties were in her name. And all 15 properties were sold over the next few years. And what she said, this is her quote to me, was it was like dominoes. One fell, and then another fell, and another fell. And then the last thing I expected, but they came from my house. And they sold her personal residence, and she walked away with a tiny amount of money. And so when she sat down with me, what she said is, I'm going to build this thing back up. And she was probably in her early 80s. Wow. So I'm sitting here with somebody's grandma who says, I'm going to build it back up in the time that I have left, and I'm not going to allow somebody to do that to me again. So I look at it. I mean, those types of things stick with you, Jose. Like you just, I always see that face, and I think of then the emotion, and that was probably 1999, 2000. That was a long time ago, and it's still like just when I think about it to this day, I always think of all the smart Alex that say get insurance. We've seen so many situations where I'm not saying don't have insurance. I'm just saying don't rely on insurance. If you do so, it's at your peril. You have good insurance, you have a good umbrella, and then you have an asset protection plan as your safety measure, much like you have on a ship. Like you're going to have, you're going to be able to cut off the liability. I forget what they call that in a submarine or anything else. You want to make sure you don't flood the whole boat out. So you have these bulwarks to stop it, and you can staunch the flooding or whatever it is. You want to be able to divide up your assets so that even if there's a major liability occurrence, it's isolated and it doesn't affect the rest. And so you got to have something in place. And if you're doing it in the midst of a liability occurrence, it's too late. You have fraudulent conveyance rules that say you can't do it after the fact. You got to have these things in place first.
So is the LLC the best way to protect yourself, or are there other vehicles to be able to better protect yourself? Or in other words, how could this lady have prevented that? Like, is just having an LLC, is it better to have all your properties in the same LLC? Is it better to have individual LLCs? Sometimes people have an LLC for each individual property. Some people say that's too much. What are some of the strategies there that somebody could utilize or that somebody should be aware of?
Yeah, Jose. So it's going to be up to the individual. So like somebody like me, my partner and I, we may have hundreds of properties. So if I'm buying 20 property package, I may put it in the same LLC. I may not care. I may say, hey, you know what, I'm okay losing this. It's not going to make or break my day. But if you have 20 properties to your name, you're probably going to want to divide them up. Best practice is to isolate each property that has substantial equity. And substantial equity is a relative comment to you. If it's something that you could not afford to lose or that would keep you up at night if you lost, then you want to make sure that you're isolating each property. So like if I have 5 properties to my name and I'm like, hey, I'm building up, I'm probably doing a single entity for each one. And the type of entity is going to depend on the jurisdiction. So for example, you're in California, you have the franchise tax, you're going to have $800 a year per LLC. Not fun. Plus, you have a surcharge on LLCs. So we're probably going to use a Wyoming statutory trust and a trust in California to avoid that. And it's going to give you the same protection as an LLC. We'll probably use an LLC out of the state for it to be the holding entity so we could still get a partnership return for lending purposes. But we're going to do something like that. If I was in Florida, land trusts have the same protections as LLCs. So and we don't have doc stamp fees if you have a mortgage on a property and we transfer it. So I might use land trust there. Or if I'm in Texas, I might say, hey, let's use a series LLC. We can set up one LLC and then it can have cells that we use those. Like it always changes depending on where you're at, but the principle is the same. We want to isolate the liability of that asset from the other assets. We call them risk assets. If it's real estate, it's a risk asset. And then also you are a risk asset. So we want to isolate it from you. And I'll just tell you, most states do not do that. Like, again, you're sitting in California where they'll pierce through those LLCs like hot knife through butter. So you don't want to be in California. So you're going to have to add a little multi-jurisdictional element to it. I may set up a Wyoming LLC where I know Wyoming statute says nobody can take it from you. The most they could get is a lien against that LLC. Why would I do that? Because if somebody's going to pin their ears back and try to take everything that I own, I want to make sure they can't. I want to have something that stops them from doing it so I can say, whoa, let's negotiate. I want to be able to sit down at that table with whoever's coming after them and say, no matter how hard you fight, no matter how much money you spend, no matter how good your lawyer is, at the end of the day, you're going to have a lien and I'm not going to pay it.
So it basically gives you leverage, basically, in the negotiation. Like, meaning, like, if you're in a state where like California, where they can force a sale almost, versus a lien, you've got no leverage, because regardless whether you like it or not, they're going to force a sale on the property, versus Wyoming, where they don't have that leverage. They'll have a lien, and if they want to get paid on that lien, you have to either sell or refinance, which you can just avoid those forever, and then they never ended up getting paid. So are there any issues with having a Wyoming LLC versus a California LLC? Like, is there anything that would create problems for you there, or what's the right way to do it if you are going to do that?
Yeah, really good question. And the answer is it depends on the activity. I like using Wyoming entities to hold safe assets like cash, brokerage accounts where it's interstate commerce in nature, or if it's holding an interest in another entity. So, for example, if I'm in California, I'm probably going to have a Wyoming statutory trust. I'm going to have either land trusts hold each property, which, by the way, if anybody ever says, oh, land trusts are not legal in my jurisdiction, what they're talking about is about 15 states have statutes on them, but you still have common law. Just like a living trust is valid in all jurisdictions, so is a land trust. They're the exact same type of trust. They're both inter vivos trusts, living trusts. They're both grantor trusts. One we use to hold all your stuff. The other one we use just for titling real estate. But we use that combination. And then we would just have the LLC there to hold the trust assets. Hey, guess what? We want to make sure that at the end of the day, there's no way that somebody could come back and take your asset. So it's like the idea of a cup of hot coffee, right? Or whatever you drink. The stuff that's in there, I want to protect from getting on me. But on the same token is I want to isolate it from me. So if I have liability, they don't take my cup away. And there are states where they have statutory protections. Nevada and Wyoming are two of them that are the best. Probably Wyoming's probably the best right now because it's so inexpensive and there's anonymity that you can achieve with Wyoming. But it makes it to where somebody cannot take that away, like force you to give it to them. If I am only in California, I can force you to give me your LLC, and then I'll liquidate it and take everything that's in it. And it kind of defeats the purpose if that's your asset protection plan.
And then this is a part that I did not understand fully. So, like, let's say that obviously you have some items or some properties in LLCs, or you have them in land trust. A part of it is still being able to grow your real estate portfolio. So you mentioned about loans and still being able to get loans. What are the best strategies there to be able to still get loans and be able to qualify for more properties as well too?
Yeah. So here's the easiest way to think about lenders is you're going to have your traditional lenders, which are loaning on my credibility, and they'll attach an asset. And then there's lenders that only loan on the asset. I'll call them an asset-based lender. When you get into portfolio loans, when you get over 10 properties, you're dealing with asset-based lenders. Until that point, you could probably still go out and get personal loans on properties. If you're doing a personal loan on property, it's almost always going to have to close in your name. Like, they do not want you closing in the name of a trust. Like, if you ever try to refi your house, if it's in a living trust, they make you take it out, put it in your name, refi it, then put it back in. A land trust is no different. We use the land trust because there's no due on sale clauses being triggered. There's no county taxes. Like where I sit here in Clark County, Nevada, if I put a property directly in an LLC, it's not taxable. I take it out, it is. If I use a land trust, not taxable going in or going out. So if I'm using financing and it's me, I need to be able to go back and forth quickly. And I need to be able to do it quickly and inexpensively. So that's number one. If that's you, you're probably using a land trust. If you're doing just cash and you're not doing any financing at all, you may skip the land trust and go straight to an LLC. If I am somebody like, hey, I have a personal residence. I'll give you an example. I have a friend and a client who is a psychiatrist and deals with some people that you don't want showing up on your doorstep. And the big question is, how do I make it to where they can't find my house? You know, we think about police officers, they don't have their names you can't go find a police officer's house because they don't want you to be able to, somebody who you lock away to come out and retaliate against you. But they let everybody else. What if you have people that you don't want to know? I don't want people to know where I live. a land trust becomes a very effective tool. We actually call it a personal residence trust, and there's a way to draft them to where your name's not on the title anymore, and you still have your capital gain exclusion, your 121 exclusion. You still get your homestead exclusion, which is the protection against lawsuits. Like, you don't give any of that stuff up, but at least we get the name off of it. So there's that aspect of it. There's the aspect of if I'm doing a portfolio loan. So for example, let's say I have 100 properties and I want to get a loan on all 100 properties. I already know what the lenders are going to do. They don't even want to secure the properties themselves. What they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, you know what, let's set up 2 LLCs and we'll give a loan to one, and it'll be owned by the second LLC, and we'll secure that loan with the second LLC. So if you don't pay, we just take your LLC away. And guess what the LLC has? 100 properties. That's how our portfolio-based loans go. So when you're dealing with an asset-based lender, they could care less about your stuff. They may say, hey, I need to see your net worth and make sure that you have some liquidity. They may look at that a little bit. They want to make sure that you're not a shyster and that you're not paying all your bills. So they might look at your credit, but that's not what they're basing it off. Most asset-based lenders only care about your cap rate and how much the asset's worth. And they just want to know that you're going to give them interest for a period of time. So they'll have a yield maintenance requirement. In our world, we usually call that a prepayment penalty. In their world, they'll call, hey, I want my yield maintenance for 5 years, which just means don't refi the dang thing for 5 years. They want to sell that paper, or they want to return for their investors, and they want to know that you're going to keep that loan on that property for a long period of time. You can't do that with individuals, because individuals like to sell their house and move every few years, right? And they always want to move it on up. They always want to get something bigger, better. And so when you're two different worlds completely, if you don't know those two worlds, you need someone who does, to make sure that you're navigating them correctly.
So, like, let's say that you have a California LLC, or let's say that you have the wrong entity. How does somebody go about changing that? And if maybe somebody has properties in their personal name, how does somebody go about changing them to the right entities, or what does that process look like? First of all, if somebody already has the wrong entities or is holding the entities in California, is there a way to change those items still, or is it too late? Assuming that there's no liability right now, meaning that you haven't committed some sort of item that would cause liability to.
Great questions, and let me try to break it down for you. So if I have a property, it's in an LLC, and let's say it's in a state where I'm like, oh, nuts, I really don't want to have a negative experience in that state.
Yeah.
Like California, for example, and you have a surcharge that could be up to like 11 grand or something on those LLCs. If I sell something, oops, I didn't mean to do that, right? You want to get that property out of that LLC. I may re-domicile it. I may exchange it, move it into another state. Just like you and I can move states, so can entities. Like Microsoft, a lot of people don't realize this. Microsoft, I think, was a Washington-based company, and then they moved to Delaware to go public. Right? You could actually move, your company can go re-domicile someplace else. And sometimes it's as easy as, hey, I'm just going to that state and I'm reclassifying it over to that state. Sometimes you have to liquidate it and set up another one in the same name. And the IRS says, keep the same EIN. We're not going to care. But from a state standpoint, you liquidated one and reopened another. So there's always kind of little nuances that are state specific, but it usually you're moving the asset out, changing the entity, moving the asset into another entity. And you got to make sure you have a tax person that knows what they're doing, because depending on that entity. So for example, if I set up an LLC in California and somebody told me S Corps were great, and I put a property in there and I convey it out to myself, that is a taxable event. I don't want to do that. That's going to be it's treated as though the company liquidated it and gave me all the cash. So it could be a very nasty consequence. So you always look at it and say, first, do no harm. Is this something where I can switch it easily? Could I re-domicile it in another state? Could I move it into a trust? Is there a way for me to get this changed so that I can fix whatever the deficiency is? The answer is yes. If I'm somebody who's starting right fresh and I just have a bunch of properties in my name, then the first question we're usually asking is there debt? Because it's a little bit of a different analysis if you have no debt versus if you do. So if you have a loan, we do not want to trigger the due on sale clause. And so we're almost always going to use some sort of trust, a grantor trust, because technically there's something called the Garn-St. Germain Act that protects trusts from triggering a due on sale clause. So long as it's your residence and it's less than 4 units, it's illegal for a bank to call it due. Even if the bank technically might still have the ability to call it due, the reality is when they see a trust, they usually say hands off. And so in 23 years of actively working in this particular space and using land trust, I've never had a single due on sale clause. And we've done tens of thousands. It's probably over 100,000 transfers at this point.
Is that only for primary residences, or does it apply for investment properties as well?
Any property.
Really?
Yeah. The Garn-St. Germain Act is specifically for residential property and something that you're using as your primary, but the banks don't differentiate it. And so if you're using a land trust, what we've seen is we've never had a due on sale, never had a bank exercise it. We have seen it on very few occasions on LLCs, but it's very, very rare. I think I've seen it twice in 20 some years. It's as long as you're paying the mortgage, most banks don't care. As long as they know it's an entity and you're not transferring it to somebody else.
Yeah. The reason I was asking is because I know that with the marketplace shifting, a lot of the investors are promoting like taking over like somebody's mortgage and giving them money to be able to get out of the property, taking over the 2% mortgage. But I know a lot of the fears are the due on sale clause. So I was wondering if this was a way not around it, but to almost like reduce that risk of something like that happening.
I did that exact transaction on multiple occasions that you're describing. We use a land trust. And what I'll do is I'll usually have the individual as the trustee put it into the trust, and then I'll have them resign and I'll step in as the trustee.
I love it.
And that way I'm in control of the property. If the bank looks at it, it looks the way they want. And I did that with a 1.98% interest rate. I think it was in 2010 on a property because I was like, this is so low. This is like after the big catastrophic fall here in Vegas. We lost 75% of our values. And he was a guy, he was going through a nasty divorce. And he was like, we want to be out of the house. And he had this beautiful loan on it. And I was like, dude, can you 5 years? Give me 5 years. This is great. This is such a low interest rate. Please, I'll buy that house. No problem. Yeah, we put it in a land trust. I used a servicing company to make sure that the payments were collected and received. And then you have a little bit of a tax issue because that individual is going to get the mortgage statement, like the 1098. So they're going to get the tax filing. Then you do the exact same thing with them where you're like, hey, they're my lender now. So you just want to make sure that you're showing that, hey, I paid them and they paid the mortgage, right?
Let's say that you're a business. I know that we've talked about real estate, but I know a large portion of our audience is also business owners as well too. Like, does the same rules apply to business owners as they do to real estate property investors, or is it different for business owners in terms of entities and that sort of thing?
It's very different for business owners. Like it's a complete other world. So you have your investments, which typically are passive investments. You're going to be buy and holding. You want transparency for the taxes to flow straight onto your return. On a business, we have a few different considerations. Number one is, taxes are usually a big one. Audit rates are a big one. The likelihood of getting sued is a big one. Am I going to sell the business? So for example, I can exclude 100% of the capital gains on the sale of a business if it's qualified small business stock. I just have to own it for a certain number of years and be below capitalization. I think it's 10 million. But most small businesses are going to qualify. I exit 10 years from now, I'll be really, really glad that I set myself up as a particular entity. In that case, it's going to be a corporation versus an LLC, right? If I'm a real estate agent, I may be looking at it like, hey, I have to be structured in a particular way. I need to be transparent because I have to deal with the real estate boards. And so there, I'm probably going to be an S corp. And the reason being is because sole proprietors get audited about 1,000% more than an S corp. They lose those audits 95% of the time. So like the worst thing you could possibly do from a tax standpoint is be successful as a sole proprietor. Like you are just going to get clobbered. And so if I'm a realtor, I'm looking at saying I need transparency. I need to save on some taxes. I also don't want to get molested by the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm probably going to be an S corp, which is a tax designation, but that does not mean that that has to be my state designation. I can actually be an LLC taxed as an S corp. And then there's like places like Texas, Illinois, some other Michigan, where a broker won't pay an entity. They may say, "Oh, I will only pay the individual agent," and then the agent says, "Oh, my accountant says I can't do anything." Again, you got to deal with accountants and attorneys that do this stuff day in and day out so that they know that there's cases like, oh, here's the workaround. It's 2 pieces of paper and I can get that done. And even if they're giving you the 1099, I can still show you how to do it. And you're going to save yourself a ton on taxes. When I say taxes, what I'm looking at specifically is if I'm a sole proprietor, 100% of my net earnings are subject to Social Security taxes. If I'm a S corp, only about 30 to 35% are subject to it if I take a small salary. The rest of it is not subject to Social Security taxes. Well, that's like, it's 15.3%. It's not a small amount. So if I'm making $100,000 a year, I could be looking at a pretty sizable difference, maybe $9,000, $10,000 on 100. Like it's a pretty large raise if I just set myself up in a tax efficient vehicle. And again, I'm looking at these things going asset protection, tax, business, which one's going to be easier to operate? Which one are they going to recognize more? And I can just say, if you're a small business, you're doing yourself a huge disservice if you're operating as a sole proprietor. You're doing yourself a huge disservice if you're an LLC that's disregarded. You want to be taxed as one of the, like a legitimate company, which would be an S or a C corp.
What about this? Like, and I think this is important because a lot of people don't see a need for like LLCs. They don't see a need for S corps. They don't believe that any of this stuff will ever happen to them. They think it's only things that they see in movies or in horror films. What about like insurance exclusions? Like, I know that you mentioned that particular case about the person getting electrified had an insurance exclusion. What are some of the other insurance exclusions that maybe you've seen that maybe people may not be aware of?
Yeah, almost always it's mold or catastrophic events like COVID was exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a small business and you had your business shut down, there's a good chance you didn't have any coverage there. If I am a real property owner and I'm a landlord, there's a good chance that I'm not going to be covered if they say it's an intentional act or if it was things like mold. If I violated something in the deep, dark regions of that policy, like, hey, I hired a non-licensed contractor, it's excluded. And so like, oops, even if they give you a card that says they're licensed and bonded, it's on you to go verify it. And most people
how does
don't.
somebody typically verify that information?
Go to the licensing board and you say, is this a valid license? Is this person active? So the case I told you about, the gal that had the with the 2 electrocutions, they actually had the license and bonding information, but they let the company had let it expire. So the window washers had let it expire, and that gave the out for the gal's insurance company to not cover. There's another one. We had a client in California. I won't give you too much of the facts, but so you can't look it up. But I'll just give you, it was 2 family members. Our client is one family member. Somebody else is with another big firm there, big muckety bucks, right? And they had a establishment where a catastrophic event occurred in the valet. The valet was a third party. Like most of the time, you don't have your own employees. You hire a valet company. So when you're like, again, at restaurants, think of nightclubs and things like that. That was excluded. The actions of the valet were excluded from the policy because they don't want to cover another business. So if I have a coverage for my business, I don't want to cover somebody else's business. That could be like, how do I even figure out what that liability is like? So they had a catastrophic event that occurred with 2 patrons and they were excluded.
Wow.
So our client got out really quick because they could not see anything else he owned. Like one of the things I'm big on is security through obscurity. If somebody can't see what I own, they're not going to know that I'm wealthy. If somebody can't see what a client owns, they don't know that that's a wealthy individual, and they usually just say, "Hey, what's the insurance? How much will you pay?" So in this particular case, there was, they're fighting over the coverage. The insurance company is saying exclusion, but it's small enough to where they were able to settle it out very quickly, like in less than 6 months. The other party had big muckety muck firm in California who everything was California entities, which was very transparent. I can see everything you own if you have it in California entities. I can just look you up. I will see all of your property. And the guy had substantial property. Here's the punchline. Our client who got out quickly has more assets than the guy that's still getting drugged through this. It's been about 5 years. Millions of dollars later, and he's still getting drugged through it. Sometimes that's just how it works, is I don't want people to see what I have and use it against me. I don't want that to be the reason somebody sues the heck out of me, right? If I did something wrong, I will pay it. If I did something wrong, I want to have a fair settlement, but I do not want to have some guy on TV who looks for clients. And, there's one guy in Texas, they call him the hammer. I don't want to get hammered because some lawyer says, aha, that's my retirement right there. I'm going to get 40% at taking that guy's stuff. I'm not going to invite that. I'm not going to invite that on my clients. I'm going to make sure that they don't see that.
So not only that, some of the like lawsuits are frivolous, like meaning like they find out that you have like a lot of money, and it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. I mean, if you get sued, you still have to defend it, even if it is a frivolous lawsuit. So sometimes it's easier to settle in that case. So is having entities in different states the best way for other people not to see what you own? Or are there ways to still have an LLC in California and for other people not be able to find you? Because I know that there's websites like opencorporates.com where somebody can literally look up the name of the LLC. They see who the agent is. They look at the address on file. Are there different ways aside from having LLCs or land trusts in different areas to protect yourself? And if so, what are those different ways?
Yeah, well, you're going to look at your toolbox in your jurisdiction, right? Mm-hmm. And you're going to use, I always look at the state as being somebody you pay. All right, so I'm from Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, if somebody walked up to you and said, hey, you have this beautiful storefront and those windows are gorgeous, and if you want to make sure nobody ever breaks your windows, it's going to cost you $100 a month, right? There's a guy that may visit your store. Let's say you have a pizza shop, and they may say, hey, nobody will ever mess with your shop. All you got to do is pay us a little bit, right? You're paying some protection money, and you know exactly what's getting done, right? They're just gonna, hey, you're paying, so we're not going to break your windows, right? Well, in a state, it's the same thing. That's all they're doing. Hey, we're going to create this LLC. It's nothing magic, right? You're paying the state some money, and they're going to say, all right, you get this magic protection, right? The liability is limited. You're literally paying protection money. That's the way to look at it. And so I may, depending on the state, I may want to be paying that state something to make sure that there's some sort of protection. But my state may be very transparent and may allow somebody, maybe it's not as good a protection. Like, hey, you know what? This is okay. Maybe they won't break my windows, but somebody still may take my whole storefront, right? So maybe I need to go to somebody else that even has more protection and pay them a little bit and say, hey, just in case it exceeds this, would you come in and protect me? And that's where you go to other jurisdictions, you start shopping it. And it's really inexpensive, actually. So like Wyoming's super inexpensive state, but they don't allow people to take your entity. California does. So what do? Quite often I'll have assets that are like, maybe I'll take my business that's owned in California, I'll have it owned by the out-of-state entity. Or I'll take my liquid assets. Hey, maybe I have a brokerage account and I'll put it in an out-of-state entity so that even if California loses its mind, you have someone on the crazy juries that just decides to hammer you, you're still sitting there going, yeah, but you still can't take it.
Yeah.
If I leave it up to the local jurisdiction, they may hand it over to whomever. And there are frivolous suits. And in California, it's nasty right now, especially for employment matters. Like I've had a number of clients that have traditional business there, And when they have an employment matter, even if it's completely specious, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars because the juries are so out of control. If you are an investor in California, you already know what I'm talking about. It takes forever to get things done. But hey, if you have black mold, all they have to do is allege it. There's not even a set standard of what really is harmful to somebody, but all they got to do is allege it. And you could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars of defending yourself. Even if you have insurance, they may not cover, or you may be looking at exclusions, or they may be claiming things that are even outside the policy. Like, oh, you knew and you didn't do anything. All right, you're acting intentionally. So it's beyond just negligence. So like sometimes these things will morph depending on your jurisdiction. And we just want to address it. We want to say, hey, you know what? These types of things, here's what you do. Number one is you always carry insurance. I'm never going to say don't. Always carry an umbrella coverage to make sure that in case the standard, the original policy is not enough, that you have something to protect you. But then don't be naive and think that that's where it's always going to stop. Make sure that you're isolating your assets so you do not get that target put right on your back. I had a friend who owns an insurance agency, very, one of the largest in the country. And her big thing was she works with a lot of doctors, and she yells at the doctors, you get in a car accident, do not tell that party, I'm a doctor, let me help you. Because even though you're trying to be a good person, you literally, that's their biggest issue, is you're inviting a monster lawsuit. Please, as the insurance companies, do not tell them. Like she's always like to her high net worth people, do not tell them who you are. You get into a car accident, be civil, but do not start volunteering that type of information unless you want one of the sharks that's on TV or on the billboards to grab a hold of that person and say, now we have a payday.
Are there certain insurance policies or insurance companies that are more investor friendly than others that would maybe like have less exclusions? That, because I mean, trying to read through a policy or through all the exclusions for maybe somebody that's not as experienced may be a little bit overwhelming, or maybe they don't know where to look like somebody like you. Any tips as it relates to insurance providers, or any tips as it relates to what to look for as it relates to that?
Yeah, talk to other investors. Talk to other people that do what you do. Ask them about their experience. Talk to really good insurance folks, that people that own their own shops that have been doing this and working with the people that do what you do. It's the same thing. Like I would not go to a regular insurance company person. Like let's just say I find an agent and I'm a doctor. Hey, I need E&O. Don't do that. Go to somebody who specializes in, hey, let's say I'm ear, nose, and throat. Go to somebody who specializes in that area. Make sure that I have coverage that's protecting me, that's adequate for me, that I'm not just transferring money over in the hopes that there's some sort of coverage. And actually have a conversation with that individual and then shop it around. There are companies that work with real estate investors, for example, and they will add in different types of coverages, rent loss, for example, things like, hey, if you didn't have this, you learned about it during COVID when nobody's paying their rent, right? So you want to make sure that you have certain types of coverages. Well, a policy that's written for real estate investors that is designed for somebody like you might have that sort of thing. Whereas if you just went to your uncle or your somebody always has a friend who knows an insurance agent, don't do that. Go to somebody who has specialized knowledge in your area. And yes, there's plenty of them. You have an apartment building, you're working with somebody who insures apartment buildings. You're a doctor, go to somebody who specializes in doctor. You're a real estate agent, make sure you're talking to somebody who insures real estate agents, and then talk to the agents. What was your experience? Have you had any issues? You ever had to use it? What were they like? Is it a depleting policy? Who's the attorneys they use? Do they force you? Like all these things, you're just having a conversation on. And then, usually there's good ones and there's bad ones, and you'll hear about it pretty quick. Oh yeah, they're really good. That they made it super easy. Or you'll hear that horror story. They wouldn't even respond. I got the lightning suit out of me. They gave me some guy that just got out of law school, didn't know what he was doing, kept forgetting my name. You hear all those stories. Listen to them.
I know that we've talked a lot about land trust in and I don't know if you're familiar with this. In California, there's something called a living trust, which is
Mhm.
basically just a form of estate planning, which is
Mhm.
basically avoids probate court. Does that provide, or, and I don't know if you know this, but does that provide any liability protection as well too? Or is that mainly just to determine like, hey, look, this is what I want happen in case I'm incapable of making decisions on my own, and in case something ever happens to me, this is how I want my affairs to be handled.
All states recognize living trusts. All states recognize land trusts. Some have specific statutes on land trusts,
Mhm.
but they're all the same type of trust. They're a grantor trust. They're called an inter vivos trust, which means they work while you're alive. They do not provide any asset protection by themselves, with the sole exception of Florida does have asset protection for land trusts. They actually have a land trust statute, so it's treated just
C
like an
corporation
LLC.
or
Yep,
LLC.
LLC. Yep, they give you the same protection as a statutory entity. So a statutory entity might be LLC, corporation, things like that. And and then there's other types of trusts. There's irrevocable trust. There's asset protection trust. Nevada has something called we call it a Nevada Protection Trust, but it's a spendthrift trust. It's got the greatest protections in the country, according to the best trust attorneys, probably the Oceans out there, the Oceans firm, who drafted the statutes, probably the top trust lawyer in the United States, and they rate them every year. It's right there. It's usually Nevada and South Dakota as having the best trust, but that's a bazooka that you take to a gunfight sometimes. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's people that makes sense for, where you can add another layer of protection, and then for most people that's like way overkill, and there might be a larger price tag. Like, I don't want to spend $3,000 a month or a year on a plan that the likelihood of me ever needing is a fraction of a percent, when I can get by for significantly less and get almost the same amount of protection.
This has been extremely helpful for me. I'm sure that it's been extremely helpful for the viewers. If somebody wanted to get a hold of you, or if somebody wanted additional advice or anything like that,
Mhm.
one, where could people find you? And then two, are there any last closing words that maybe you think would be helpful for the viewers as well too?
Yeah, here, let me do the how to get a hold of me. You just type in tobymathis.com, Toby Mathis on the internet. You'll find me all over the place. And what I would suggest you do is join our community on YouTube. My partners has a community that's a pretty good sized community as well. And then we do something called Tax Tuesdays, where it's free. You can come in and ask your questions and do all that stuff,
Love
and
it.
start to consume the information, because it's an educated client is the best client. And I'm not saying that I don't love talking to people that aren't, but there's nothing that beats somebody starting to do a little bit of their own investigation, and then they start getting questions, and that's a much better conversation than somebody saying, what do I do? Right? You want to actually raise the level up, so we have really good conversations. But that's what I would do, and it's free, so I like free. As far as words of advice, I'll tell you, way back when I was telling you about the first real estate agent that I met that had all those properties. One of the things that he said to me that kind of, again, these things stick, was you should be investing in what you do. And so if your audience, Jose, is if your audience is real estate agents and they're in real estate, please buy investment real estate. There's really, I always look, there's rents, royalties, dividends, interest, and short-term capital gains when you sell options on securities. Like, there's five types of incomes that I like as a tax guy that are always going to be the best. Those are all passive income sources that you don't have to work for. They're just going to provide you with money. I love that. Real estate creates the rents. That's one of the big ones. Please be investing in it. Don't just be one of those people that makes your living selling it to other people. Make sure that you are taking a portion. I don't care if it's 10%, put it aside and say, I'm going to buy a property every few years. I'm going to buy a piece of property for myself and for my family and for my legacy. Please do that. You will not be disappointed. 30, 40 years of doing that, you are going to be so wealthy. You're not going to have to work. You'll be so happy that you did it. Trust me on this. The numbers always pencil out. The longer you do something that's smart, the better the results, and you start looking like a genius. Again, 10, 20 years in, you'll be shocked at how different your financial picture is. You just keep
Yeah.
doing it and don't stop.
There's a saying, Toby, it's like, don't wait to buy real estate and wait. Because if you hold it for enough period of time, rents tend to go up, principal tends to get paid down, that gap becomes larger, and that gap becomes your wealth. So I really appreciate having you on the show. I've enjoyed our conversation. For our viewers today, we had Toby Mathis with Anderson Business Advisors. He is a tax attorney. If you have enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you feel that this episode will be helpful for somebody, make sure to hit that share button and share it with any friends. Thanks again, Toby. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to having you on the show again and providing additional education for anybody interested in real estate.